We were told the FBI was on its way and it would be a couple hours. And of course, they never came.
But retired FBI agent Ron Walker says the FBI is called in.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Wow, this is episode 6 in our series on peripheral figures.
What does that mean?
It means buckle your seatbelt, Dorothy, because Kansas is going bye-bye.
For FBI agent Ron Walker, this is how the Ramsey case really started. Boulder PD's Larry Mason said, "Oh fuck, Ron, it's a homicide." More completely, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, Walker felt it was a homicide made to look like a kidnapping because at this stage he was already examining the ransom note. Now, if that's what happened, if it was a homicide made to look like a kidnapping, why would they want to do that?
Now, why would you want to do that?
One of the FBI agents in the room, I remember him saying, "You always have to look at the family."
The phone rang, and it was one of the individuals from our field office, not an agent, but one of the investigative clerks, just calling to notify me that there had been a kidnapping reported in Boulder.
He gets the call at 9:30 a.m. and immediately sets things in motion, sending agents to the police station to set up a command center, putting traps and traces on the Ramsey funds.
First thing that struck me about the note was the length of the note. It was quite unusual to see this magnum opus. The next thing that really jumps out at you is the $118,000.
The ransom note seems to implicate the housekeeper, specifically that $118,000. We know the housekeeper was asking Patsy for a small amount of money just before Christmas. How do we know? Because the Ramseys told us this. Amazingly, the Ramseys implicate their housekeeper as early as page 19 in their book, in just the second chapter, dealing with December 26th at midday. And that's this excerpt right here. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you want to look at the series of books I've written on the JonBenet Ramsey case, head on to truecrimerocketscience.com and you'll see those books written in the order they were written in, with links to those books on that page. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button. By the way, a big thank you to Deborah for your $50 Australian super thanks. Thank you very much for that. And let's get started. Now, what's interesting in this excerpt from The Death of Innocence is, although this is about Patsy and what Patsy thinks, you really are hearing John's voice. John is the narrator. John is the author of this particular part. Now, it does make one wonder, why isn't Patsy talking about this part? Because she is the one involved. So just think about that. And so this is how the narrative goes. The police ask Patsy these same questions about who might have been angry or acting strangely, and she begins to think about our cleaning lady. So this is not the first person. It's not, I begin to think about our cleaning lady, right? Linda Hoffman Pugh had called Patsy a couple of days before Christmas, very distraught and in tears. Why can't Patsy provide a first-person narrative for this particular aspect? She was the one who spoke to Linda Hoffman Pugh. Linda said that her sister, who was also her landlord, was going to evict her if she didn't come up with the past due rent. So it's not just that the housekeeper needs money, it's quite urgent, it's quite serious. And she turns to the Ramseys for help, for financial assistance. She asked Patsy if she could borrow $2,500 to cover it. Patsy had consoled Linda and agreed to lend her the money. In fact, Patsy had intended to leave the check for Linda on the kitchen counter before leaving for Michigan. Linda would let herself in the house and pick it up while we were gone for the holidays. Now, what this suggests is that Patsy would have left a note, right? This note would have been a check for money for the housekeeper. And did that happen? I don't think it did happen, which sort of puts the ball in the housekeeper's court. You wanted money, you needed money, perhaps you didn't find the check, and so did you then take matters into your own home? And then there's also this. Patsy remembers that her mother, Nidra, had said that Linda had remarked to her at one time, JonBenet is so pretty. Aren't you afraid that someone might kidnap her? Now those comments seem strangely menacing. Think about how early all of this is mentioned in their narrative dealing with the events of this ransom note, and how they are implicating, or certainly how the housekeeper is implicated by this narrative, isn't it? And the housekeeper would actually sue the Ramseys for making these statements, and she would actually lose that lawsuit. But I do think saying something like, aren't you afraid someone might kidnap her, in this context, it seems to be laying it on a bit thick, isn't it? Because ultimately, when the investigations went into this area of the housekeeper, there was very little evidence to support that theory. Now, the insertion of the very specific ransom amount also tells us something else about the real ransom note writer. If it's not Linda Hoffman Pugh, she didn't write the note, then who did write the note? This number was also very similar to John Ramsey's bonus that year, which suggests an inside job. The housekeeper may have been one individual who knew about John's bonus, but who were other individuals who might know? And that brings us to a really interesting area. Several checks are visible in crime scene video near the staircase on a wooden shelf. In fact, this might be why the note was left where it was, to draw attention to this very fact, these checks. And think about how the idea of a check is also mentioned in the Ramsey's book as early as the page 19. And have a look at this crime scene footage. If you really think about it, it's quite a nondiscreet way of leaving checks around the house. They are facing outward. There are numerous checks all in this very public and very accessible area of the home. Is that really where they normally left these checks? Is that something you've ever seen someone do in your home? Is that something your father ever did? Is that something you've literally ever done yourself? People tend to be a lot more discreet about leaving things like checks like this lying around, certainly in my experience. But I think the point to make here is that where these checks are so kind of obviously laid out, you also have the ransom note also obviously laid out. And wasn't the idea to create a kind of a context, perhaps a false context, between these checks and the ransom note, between the ransom note and these checks? And what is the number mentioned in the ransom note? 118,000. What does that have reference to? Well, checks like these. And have a look at this post by Jason K. Jensen. He's an investigator. He writes, JonBenet Ramsey case, in my opinion, this is the source of the 118,000 ransom amount near the spiral staircase. And here you can actually see it in context. There you see where the ransom note was left. There you see the checks to deposit. And it's not just that. According to John Ramsey, the $118,000 was an annual bonus issued to him in January 1996, and it was listed on each and every pay stub during 1996. So wouldn't that have been visible on some of these checks? Now, I disagree with Jensen. At least one investigator was duped by this contextuality. I mean, either someone legitimately saw the bonus amount, or someone wanted you to think that someone saw it. But let's go down another level. Who would know, who had access to the writing pad and the Sharpie pen, and who knew that the housekeeper was implicatable? I know that's not really a word, but who would know that the housekeeper was someone that, given the context of what was going on with her, would be implicatable?
Really odd number to ask for. The 118,000 is a low figure, but it's also a very unusual figure because it's just not typical of what you would expect to see. You expect to see 200,000, 300,000, 250,000, a million, a half a million, but not $118,000.
The other thing with a relatively low amount is, would a foreign faction really be asking for such a low amount? I mean, wouldn't the foreign faction need more money to fund their international operations? And so I think the other thing that this low amount makes one wonder about is the person who's asking for it someone who doesn't have a very high income, someone who is kind of in hard times, someone like the housekeeper?
All of this really, I mean, in aggregate, sort of indicated to me that the note was essentially bogus.
This is really the most shocking thing about the Ramsey case. When the note was received, before JonBenet was found, the note seemed obviously bogus. It wasn't only this FBI agent who felt that way. There were other officers who felt that things right from the word go, right off the bat, seemed hinky. And then JonBenet is found, not kidnapped, and then some idiots still think there is a ransom note and an intruder and a kidnapping. Did kidnappers call? No one seems to care about that. Was there some obvious sexual crime? No, and no one seems to care about that either. And this is the value of having the FBI involved. They're not just looking at the evidence. They're looking at the criminal psychology underlying the staging. Most people get caught up on the staging. Sure, if there are signs of staging, that's one thing. But what is the staging trying to say? And more pertinently, what is it trying to hide? And who is hiding it? And why is it so important? Now, I believe the cover-up had a financial motive, not the crime itself, right? The crime itself I don't think had a financial motive, but the cover-up did. And I suspect there was a sexual element to the crime, but not an overtly sexual one. Now, what does that mean? Well, if the crime wasn't financial and it wasn't overtly sexual, then it was something else. That something else is what no one talks about, because they get so caught up in trying to verify the staging or validate a cover-up or to prove that there was staging, but they never go beyond that. No one ever goes beyond that to say, so if there was staging, if there was a cover-up, staging to cover up what specifically? Covering up to protect who specifically? With the exception of all the FBI agents or former FBI who looked into this case, who has really gone into that area? In other words, what was the real nature of this crime? What was the real nature of the motives of the people at the center of this? What was essentially being covered up? Why was it so important to cover it up? And so these FBI personnel did look into this. They did examine this. And they were these three individuals. Greg McCreary, he was the first agent John approached to be part of Team Ramsey. McCreary, to his credit, turned down the invitation.
As we speak right now, the team of investigators are at the FBI Academy presenting the evidence there, going over it again. So we're kind of at that stage of the game right now.
What's the most incriminating evidence that you are aware of?
Well, I think it's the totality of the circumstances. There's no smoking gun here.
That's Greg McCreary giving an interview on the 11th of September 1997. And he talks about all the evidence being basically studied at the FBI headquarters.
I think at this point the investigation has to be pretty much wrapped up. All the lab exams have been done. I think there's been a ton of interviews conducted. I think probably everything is pretty much gathered. All the evidence that there is to gather is probably gathered at this point. And I think that, clearly it's being evaluated now as we speak right now.
So do you see this idea that the FBI weren't involved at all in the Ramsey case is a bit of a myth? So McCreary turned down John's invitation. John Douglas, I'm not sure if he was the second or the fifth, but he took up John on his offer and promptly pronounced John innocent. John Douglas was right, I believe, because John didn't write the ransom note and didn't hurt his daughter, but the grand jury didn't seem as quick to give John a vote of 100% confidence. I've actually got a book here written by Cyril Wecht, who seems to implicate John. I'm quite surprised that This book is mentioned so seldom. Who Killed JonBenet by Dr. Cyril Wecht and Charles Bosworth Jr. You would imagine something like that would get onto John's radar and he'd want to challenge that. I mean, in the same way that Burke has challenged some of the accusations. Now, in any event, a third FBI agent was basically there all along. In fact, he actually went to the house, went to the basement, saw John and Patsy in real time, saw a deceased JonBenet and wondered, what are we missing? What aren't we seeing? And while that agent was sort of excluded from the investigation, he nevertheless formed part of the aftermath anyway, including the media narrative. And in that sense, he was an important asset to this case. That agent, of course, was Agent Ron Walker.
The girl that's depicted in this particular photograph looks like she's 13, 14 years old. And then someone told me, well, that's one of her beauty pageantry, publicity shots.
Walker thought that was a possible lead.
Now, where people normally go with that is to pedophiles, but if you think about it logically, who is the likeliest to notice a little girl looking older than she really is? Well, older boys, of course, and her older brother likely had friends, boys, who noticed JonBenet wasn't like other girls. Something else that Walker highlighted was that even some of John Ramsey's behavior wasn't entirely typical like this.
Another detective saw him on the phone, apparently talking to his pilot, telling the pilot to get the plane ready. We're getting out of here.
FBI agent Ron Walker.
And he was told at that point by a detective, well, you're not going anywhere.
That's not what you said. You said he was being transferred.
That's correct.
You said, is there any
recall what I said.
I can have the court reporter read back to you.
I know what I said. I don't have to have it read back to me like I'm... Why?
But what if we do read this excerpt back, and this is from The Death of Innocence. Detective Mason asks me what our plans are, and I tell him we will go to Atlanta. He says something about staying around for a few days, and I agree. Now, before that, he says, I try to focus on what we're going to do next. Boulder isn't really our home. Atlanta is. We need to go home now to our parents. That's what we should do. Then it's Detective Mason asks me what our plans are. Now, you'll notice we are getting a slightly different version of events from John and FBI agent Ron Walker. Which one is more accurate? Interestingly, the Ramseys don't seem to mention an FBI agent was at their home there and then. Instead, they seem to focus on the FBI not being there.
We were told the FBI was on its way and it would be a couple hours. And of course, they never came.
And here's the section in their book dealing with this aspect, page 24. We assume that he is with the FBI. Finally, the police will get help, I think. Later, I learned that Mason is another Boulder PD detective and that the police, in fact, have kept the FBI at bay, not letting them inside the house. Now, is that accurate? We are told we must leave the house now. And now, if you read this without insight, you might assume that no one from the FBI paid any attention to the Ramsey case and that this was part of a comedy of errors that botched the case. In reality, the FBI were involved, were advising from a distance, and then were actually present. Ron Walker was present. Ron Walker was at the scene, basically at the first available opportunity, at about 1:30 p.m. on December 26th, barely 15 minutes after Linda Arndt's Code Black page.
We looked at domestic employees. We looked at the pageants that she had participated in, and we looked at the registered sex offenders.
And detectives very much wanted to speak again at length with John and Patsy Ramsey.
So there's another look at Jane Harmer. We dealt with her in more detail in the previous analysis, talking about, yes, she is talking about casting a wide net. And then Ron Walker really says it. Who doesn't want to sit down with police to find out who killed their child? And this was the situation he was presented with, that the police were presented with on the day after Christmas. The police wanted to sit down and properly interview the Ramseys. How did the Ramseys feel about that?
Detective Jane Harmer says Boulder police cast a wide net.
Who doesn't want to sit down with police and find out who killed their child?
Yeah. You would think that a parent whose children had been harmed in some fashion or murdered, I would be demanding to meet with the police.
I would too. Didn't the Ramseys want answers?
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
What's interesting in the aftermath to JonBenet being found is that the Ramseys go to friends and they're sort of unavailable for a while. You know, John said at one point that he could write a book on how to behave.
I think I could write the book on how you should act.
But I think most people would say it was strange that the Ramseys seemed to want to be left alone that afternoon just after their daughter's body was found. You know, in their book, John describes them arriving at the furnace and crumpling down on the living room floor. It sort of suggests that they sort of lay down and rested and slept. If someone was up all night staging or writing notes, you'd imagine by then they'd be exhausted, you know, by midday the next day and would need to catch up on sleep. So was the Ramsey housekeeper napping when the police came knocking? Well, who was?
For FBI agent Ron Walker, it started as a simple matter of arithmetic.
In 1997, the FBI did a study on the relationship between victim and offender in the murders of children in their homes. 71% were murdered by their parents or a family member.
71% of children were murdered by their parents or a family member. That's according to an FBI study in 1997, really just the year it's very current, the year following JonBenet's death. That's something you'll also hear from Greg McCreary and from me. I studied stats, and although it's clearly an area of true crime many of you guys find the most boring, I tend to see it as the most insightful. It often tells us not what we want to believe, but what we don't want to believe.
Beyond the statistics, there were things about John and Patsy Ramsey that struck investigators as odd.
When I get to the house, I'm told by the detective that was there that morning that the Ramseys barely even acknowledged each other or spoke to each other.
I think I could write the book on how you should act.
But do you remember what the other housekeeper, Linda Wilcox, said on the Peter Boyle's radio show? She said it wasn't an affectionate relationship. She said that more than once. And think about the health of other people in this story. Think about the health of the dog, Shark, the dog that was so sick that Patsy eventually gave it back. Think about even Patsy's health, where the housekeeper said that when Patsy was at her worst, John Ramsey wasn't at her side. And so in the context of that, one's also got to think about the health of these parents, the health of their relationship in the context to something happening to their daughter. And could that have anything to do with this 71% statistic? And then one's got to compare that to the possibilities and suspicions surrounding other suspects, such as the housekeeper and others. So when this FBI agent is trained in profiling, when he highlights this, that the Ramseys barely spoke to each other, I mean, how did we miss this? It does make one wonder, did Patsy, in one particular scenario, did Patsy blame John for what happened to JonBenet? I don't mean that she thought John was directly responsible, but him being so busy, did she feel a sense of grievance against him within that particular scenario, in a general sense? Or was it possible that John, just as his business was really getting off the ground, how could Patsy have allowed this to happen to their children, to him? Or was there kind of a mutual thing, or was something going on before the fact anyway? Then there's also this shocker, which I think is often overlooked or simply dismissed.
And then Patsy Ramsey's demeanor after the body was found.
She had her face covered with her hands, but she was looking at me through the fingers of one of her hands, like she was watching me.
Now you might say, I'm not sure if Ron Walker observed this firsthand. Is he talking about another officer? Or what do you think? Is he talking about this firsthand? He's saying, she was looking at me through one of her hands. This is an FBI agent's firsthand experience, encounter with Patsy at the crime scene.
Now, all the other emotive stuff that I saw from her, I thought was genuine. I didn't see any crocodile tears. I don't think that she was acting. She was truly emotionally distraught that morning.
I don't know about you, but I get a balanced sense from Ron Walker that he's not like just focusing on the Ramseys. He's also sensitive to what was genuine and what was real. and he's kind of sympathetic in a sense to Patsy, which I think is the key to understanding this case. It's not just having a black and white attitude, it's also being able to see the subtleties. Subtleties that are negative, yes, but also the subtleties that are positive. Because I'm sure he's right. I'm sure some of it was genuine. I'm sure Patsy was genuinely traumatized and grief-stricken, because I believe her when she says,
I did not have anything to do with it. I love that child.
But Walker is suggesting there was something else going on that wasn't genuine. The ransom note wasn't genuine. And now these hands he thinks he sees over her face, that's making him wonder, is there something else going on that's not only not genuine but counterfeit? Something that's not just fake but more elaborate than that. Pageantry. Has this crime been converted into a pageant, and is the ransom note part of that pageantry? Is the broken window in the suitcase part of that? Was the dramatic discovery of JonBenet in the basement before the light was turned on pageantry? Or is the content of the ransom note these movie quotes and all the stuff about foreign factions and all of that, all of that intrigue? There are two gentlemen looking over her. Pageantry. And if the Ramsey story was completely true and completely reliable and completely innocent, why did the pineapple fragment suggest that something else happened? That JonBenet wasn't exhausted that night, that she didn't go to bed when they said that she did, that she wasn't asleep when they said she was. Ironically, the same thing repeated itself with Burke. Dr. Phil touched on this exact thread during his interview with Burke when he said,
critics would say you weren't curious because you already knew. He didn't have to get up and go check because he knew exactly what had happened.
And look how Burke responds to this question. Look at the expression on his face. Look at the flicker of emotion at his mouth. Let's watch that in slow motion at 1:46. What Dr. Phil is essentially asking is whether any of the Ramseys might have guilty knowledge. Did Burke have guilty knowledge? Does his behavior indicate that at all? Did Patsy have guilty knowledge? Did her behavior indicate that at all? Did John have guilty knowledge? Did his behavior indicate that at all? One of the shock claims made on Dr. Phil by Burke, something that we'd never heard before, and here we were hearing it for the first time in 2016, was that Burke was actually up when everyone else was in bed playing with a toy.
The idea that you used a flashlight to put him to sleep and that he came back down to play with a toy. Like when he's down and people are sleeping, has he ever talked, like, did he get the sense that someone else was in the home? Did he hear anything? I don't know how long was he up?
No, we've never asked him that. I don't know. I didn't know, frankly, that he got up again.
John's reaction to this earlier this year was also, I thought, kind of interesting. I didn't know, we never asked him that. Do you notice how John is sitting, and then right when that question is asked, right at the end, he crosses his arms. And, when this question is asked and he feels he has to answer it, and he basically says, that's fiction. But coming back to the FBI agent on the scene, basically talking about, well, it sounds like he feels the Ramseys were truly upset, but also behaving suspiciously, right? Suspiciously in a way towards each other. And if not suspiciously, well then unusually, not just in terms of the situation, but as I say, towards each other in terms of the situation. Strange, isn't it? And I think what he's suggesting is that Patsy was using her grief as a sort of shield. This is when he's talking about her hands in front of her face. Firstly, to block an impression, his impression of her, right? An impression from the viewer, in this case, someone from the FBI observing her, those hands in front of her face basically create a shield between him and her. Secondly, arguably using her grief as a shield through which she could see what was going on from a safe place. All of this, of course, is subjectivity. Everything to do with demeanor and behavior isn't evidence. It isn't scientific. It's subjective. But does the agent have a point? Is this behavior is it so far from the norm that it is actually suspicious?
I thought to myself, what the hell was Alex Hunter trying to hide here? Was he afraid to sign that true bill, charge the Ramseys, take them to trial?
Well, there's a lot more to say, but I think I've stretched many of your attention spans well beyond breaking point as it is. I'm not going to take it further than that, at least for now. If you'd like me to do part 2 on Ron Walker and the other FBI agents involved in this story, McCrary and Douglas, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.